I'm Nelson Cowan.
I'm Andres Alfaro.
I'm Mark Kakowski.
And we're here with Mr. William Tisdale at Marquette University High School in Milwaukee, Wisconsin on November 12th, 2017. Hello, Mr. Tisdale.
Hello.
So we're going to be interviewing you about topics concerning Fair Housing Council, arts and visual arts, and other arts in Milwaukee.
Okay.
But first, we'd like to get into your childhood,
All right.
early life. So we understand that you didn't grow up in Milwaukee or Wisconsin. So could you tell us about where you grew up and your family and your schooling?
I grew up in Rockford, Illinois, just south of the Wisconsin border. And, at that time, it was the second largest city in Illinois. It was blue-collar industrial. So I grew up on the south side of Rockford. That was back in 1950 when I was born. At that time, we had junior high schools. So I had an elementary school, which was grades kindergarten through 6th grade, and then there was Washington Junior High School I went to, which was 7th through 9th grade, and then high school, 7th through 9th grade, and then high school was 10th through 12th. So the schools were very close to where I lived. I grew up in a very somewhat integrated neighborhood, African American, Latino, and mostly Italian individuals lived in my neighborhood. So I had a variety of friends, a variety of lifestyles and different cultures that I was exposed to very early on. So I had a two-parent family. I have 4 sisters, all of them except for one is older than I am. So by the time I was up and around to be conscious of things going on, my older sisters were out of the house, and my younger sister and I basically grew up together. So that's a little bit about my childhood.
Okay, so what was the day like in your childhood when you were going to school for elementary school or junior high?
Generally, probably like most other kids, we could walk to elementary school and walk to our junior high school. So generally getting up, Mom made breakfast for us, and we walked to school. And in fact, I think I had kind of a unique situation because I never brought my lunch to school. So that was something that was kind of unusual. So I came home for lunch in elementary school, and at the junior high school, they made lunch there, which I thought were very good. So when I went to high school, obviously stayed in school all day. But generally, a typical day would be going to school and then coming back home for lunch. My dad worked third shift, or second shift, so he was home until about 3 o'clock, and then he worked 3 to 11. By the time he got home in the evenings, I was in bed. So we saw my dad a little bit in the morning. He was usually sleeping when we left, and my mom was a stay-at-home mom until probably I went into junior high school, and then she started working doing cleaning. So she would clean people's houses, and my dad worked at a factory, and he was there for the entire period that he was working. So my dad worked in a factory, was a blue-collar factory worker. So we had very much instilled in us that school was important. Work was important, and by the time I was 15, I actually had a job. So it was not by necessity, but the fact that I wanted a car. I always wanted a car, and obviously my parents didn't have enough money to buy me a car. So I actually started bussing tables when I was 15 years old, and then from that point have been working ever since. So I've been working since I was 15. Basically for reasons that I wanted something, and that was the way to get it. You worked for it. So that gives you a little bit of background about what my parents instilled in us. We were a religious family. I grew up Baptist. My parents went to church. My parents were actively involved in other kinds of church activities. Never socialized much. From that I mean I never went to a restaurant. We never went out to restaurants, never stayed in a hotel. When we traveled to see our relatives in the South, we made day trips. And one of the things I'll be talking to you a little bit about later is some of the experiences we had driving down to Alabama which would be very interesting in today's world because we couldn't stay in hotels and couldn't get gas and couldn't go to the bathroom unless it was marked for black people. So that was generally some of the information that I could provide you with as far as how I grew up and what my early life was like, at least.
So you said that while going through your first job, you were saving up for a car? What was that car?
I had a 1962 Pontiac Tempest. That's you guys won't know what that looks like, but it was a small car. Probably it was what we call a compact car now. So it's 62 Tempest, and I could drive by the age of 16. And so I got my license, and did my road test and my written test the same day. That was on my birthday, May 13th. It was raining that day. There was a thunderstorm. I took the road test anyway. I passed both of them, and I was the happiest guy in the world at that point, because then I went out and bought a car. So I had a 62 Pontiac Tempest, which I drove my friends to high school in. They chipped in for money. Back then, gas was 35 cents a gallon. So you could go a long way on $2, which my dad would give me $5 a week for gas, but I usually spent it for something else. So that was a lot of fun growing up, very collegial relationship with friends. All of my neighbors that I grew up with were from two-parent households, met them either at church or school, and it was a very, very, I think, idyllic kind of situation that I had growing up. It was the typical Leave It to Beaver, except I was black.
So we understand that you've held many jobs before. You became CEO of the Milwaukee Metropolitan Fair Housing Council. Could you describe some of those early jobs that you had? Well,
the first job I had was a busboy at a restaurant, and then they promoted me to what we now call, in the old days, they call a soda jerk. So I worked behind the fountain. So I made hot fudge sundaes and ice cream cones and all of those kinds of things at this restaurant. This was a family restaurant, so it wasn't like Denny's. We used to have a restaurant here many years ago called Heinemann's. And so it was more like Heinemann's than Denny's or Applebee's or someplace like that, kind of cozy. So I worked there for a while, and I made $1.25 an hour. So you would imagine it'd take a long time to save up for a car, $1.25 an hour. So I made $1.25 an hour there, and then I got a different job after that. I think I worked there for a couple of years while I was in high school. And then I think my senior year I started working at Piggly Wiggly, and I was a stock clerk at Piggly Wiggly, so I stocked the baby food aisle there and bagged groceries. So I made a little bit more there because that was a union situation where you had to pay union wages, so I got a little bit more money from that job, and that's when I actually was able to kind of buy things. My first check, which I thought was interesting, when I worked as a busboy, my first check, I bought a bottle of cologne, and I thought, boy, and I bought my own stuff. It was really cool. So I had a bottle of Brut cologne, and I thought, I just remembered that throughout my life, because that was the first thing I guess was really important that I could get with my $1.25 an hour, working like 7 hours a week. So that was interesting. The next kinds of jobs I've had, generally during college, I was a tutor, English composition tutor in college. So students that were having trouble writing skills, I assisted with that. That didn't pay a lot, but I did get some money from doing that. And then I think my next real job, I was I worked at a university accounting service, so that was working with student loans. That wasn't very interesting, but then I got a job as managing a toy store. So I managed KB Toy and Hobby over here at Mayfair. And so that was a job after I moved to Wisconsin. I got that job and worked at KB Toy and Hobby. Prior to that, though, I was a police officer for 7 years, and that was very interesting work, and that was something I always wanted to do from watching all the TV shows, and I said, boy, that's really something I'd like to try. And so I was a police officer for 7 years, which is probably helped shape many of the things that I do now. Contacts with people and being able to assist people just carried through, and ended up doing this kind of work. But that was a very meaningful time of my life as well.
So you said you were a police officer. Do you have any special moments from when you were on the job?
Gosh, I had lots. Almost every day was a special moment. One of the things about being a police officer is that every day is different. There are no 2 days that are the same. Some days are slower than others, where you're doing traffic stops or, taking reports for someone who had had their house broken into or things of that nature. Other times, actually getting to altercations, which is not the fun part of the job. But you meet a variety of people. You meet everyone from the folks who have, glass enclosed indoor swimming pools to folks that are living on public assistance. So you treat all of those folks the same, and all of them are important. So I think the most meaningful thing there was actually meeting a different range of people, and everyone had different problems, but all of their problems were important, and what I could do to provide that assistance, I think, made the job meaningful. So, investigated murders and burglaries and bike thefts, from the top to the bottom. Serious things to things that aren't so serious, but are important no matter what. If it happened to you, it's important.
So you talked about an early job in Milwaukee. How did you get to move to Milwaukee?
Actually, I was in college at Northern Illinois University. That's in DeKalb, Illinois. That's about 90 miles from Chicago. Actually, about 60 miles from Chicago, 90 miles from here. I was in school as an undergraduate. I majored in political science, and thought, that wasn't really feeling, where was I going to do with that degree? I didn't want to, go on and get into academics necessarily, which I'd have to do several other layers of education in order to meet those requirements. I still had that in my head that I wanted to be a cop. So I applied to the police department. They had openings at that time. I applied to the police department, was a police officer there, and then after I was a police officer for a while, I'm thinking, this isn't something I want to do forever either. There's something more I want to do to connect resources to to the individuals who needed those resources. So I applied at UWM among other schools. UWM at that point had a program, or has a program, in urban studies, so I went to graduate school at UWM. So that's how I got to Wisconsin. So I, after graduating at NIU with a BA in poli-sci, I moved to Milwaukee to go to UWM, and that's when I actually had my other jobs, the toy store manager and the accounting services. That's what I was doing before I got my job at the Fair Housing Council.
So you have you're the CEO of the Fair Housing Council,
Mm-hmm.
and you were also a police. So you talked about getting resources for people,
Mm-hmm.
getting things for people. Why do you think you enjoy that?
I think the way I grew up, I never knew that how little money we had, and I was always provided for, but there were always people I knew who didn't have as much as we did. And they had to live on government assistance, and even if their parents were working, they still didn't have enough money. And then there were other folks that just seemed to have all the breaks. So I think all through my life I wanted to connect what those individuals who didn't have enough and where those resources were, and to kind of guide them into that. I think that's probably one of the reasons I became a police officer, is to make sure things were balanced, that people didn't take things from others that didn't belong to them, and people who had things were in the mode of sharing those things, providing opportunities for other individuals. So those individuals who didn't have things actually had opportunities to get out of situations they were in. Generally, people don't know what all those resources are. Now we have computers, and we have websites, and we have all those kinds of things. There's still people who don't have those things. So people say, oh, just look it up on the internet. Well, if you don't go to the library, and you don't have a computer, and you don't have a phone that can access the internet, you're kind of stuck getting your information from wherever. And so I wanted to be in a situation where I provided a link between those people that didn't have things and all of the things that were there for them to have access to. So both of those jobs, being a police officer as well as in being involved in the Fair Housing Council, affords me that opportunity to provide that service. So it's very much connected with how I grew up, and the kinds of things I wanted to do when I grew up.
So earlier you mentioned starting in the UW Milwaukee, starting college at UW Milwaukee.
Yes.
So what were your first impressions of Milwaukee and the UWM campus?
Well, I had been in Milwaukee for about a year before I actually started my new job, my job with the Fair Housing Council. My first impressions were Milwaukee seemed to be very, even back then, segregated from an outsider's point of view. There were places that African Americans went, there were places that whites went. You didn't see much interaction between the two, as from my perspective. So there were clubs I went to when I, was old enough to go to clubs and socialize. Not very many were mixed. And those that were mixed were younger people. So most of the older people had their old standby places they went. Never saw a white person or very few white people in those areas. Whereas when I lived in Illinois, I went to Chicago a lot. You see a lot of interracial relationships in Chicago, a lot of friends walking down the street, a lot of folks of different races walking and meeting at different places. Back then I didn't see it that often. So you spend a lot of time downtown, you see people downtown, you see people in the classrooms. It was very odd to see that there were black students in some areas of the student union, and whites in other areas, but very few did you see blacks and whites and Latinos together. So I thought that was very odd. So my first impression was, wow, there are pockets of people. There are people who live in certain places, work certain places, socialize in certain places, and they tend to remain in those areas. And I thought that was quite unusual given other types of social situations I had experienced.
So you talked about the segregation in Milwaukee. Do you have any idea what caused that, or do you have any opinions about what caused that?
Oh, there are lots of opinions I have, and lots of also data that I have about that. It depends on how deep you want to go into it, but essentially segregation is either economics, it's caused by self-selection or discrimination. So people say the self-selection is choice, but people generally get that choice piece mixed up. The choice piece is that whites have choices. Most African Americans and Latinos don't. So economics, people say, well, you can live wherever you can afford to live. That's not necessarily true. There are a lot of other institutional factors that go into where people live, what choices are available to people, and how people get to where they live. The choice argument is that people live where they choose to live. Well, that sometimes is true. And other times those choices are made limited by information that people have about what's available to them. Discrimination obviously is something I'll talk to you about as part of this discussion. But discrimination plays a major role in what our community looks like from the standpoint of segregated communities and segregated residential areas.
Okay, so we'd like to take a quick break.
Okay.
So did anybody help you form these ideas of segregation in Milwaukee? So did you talk to anybody about the segregation that you're experiencing?
Well, most of the folks I was talking to at the time I met through school, because I came up here to work on my graduate degree. So my whole experience based on what Milwaukee looked like and what some of the factors, some causation of how people decide and where people live and why they live where they live. Most of that initially was through school and courses I took in school. The interesting part about discrimination and segregation is that discrimination and segregation occurs in many instances because of discrimination. And individuals don't know they're discriminated against because it's subtle. Very seldom nowadays do people come right out and say, we don't want your kind living here, you're not welcome. Years ago, that was fairly common. So to actually, when we talk to African Americans, when I talk to African Americans, many of them said, yeah, I don't know, I haven't had a problem. But where did they look? for housing? Where did they look for jobs? What kind of jobs they looked for? And then if you're being treated in a courteous and polite manner, you don't necessarily know that you're being discriminated against. I had an instance when, after I worked at the Fair Housing Council, I was out at one of the shopping malls, I won't mention the name, out at one of the shopping malls in one of the suburbs. And you know, when you go to one of the anchor stores, they have all of the cosmetics and they have colognes and things out on the countertops. So I was walking by and I walked by and there's colognes out there and they have the samplers. So the person that was the clerk was waiting on another person on the other side. You know, it's in a horseshoe. And so he was waiting on her and I was just kind of looking at the stuff and he kept looking over at me. And you know, I was telling him no big rush and he kept looking. Finally he excused himself from the woman and came over, took the shelf off and put it under the counter and then went back and started talking to the woman. I'm standing there looking. I'm thinking, now, did he think I was going to take the cologne? And I'm thinking, you know, this is very odd. And I felt just so humiliated. I walked out of the store. I didn't say anything. I stood there for a moment just shocked, and I didn't know whether to jump over the counter and pop him in the head, which some people do, or just to leave. But I was so humiliated. I walked out of that store and I was thinking, what did I do? You know, what was, you know, I'm, you know, dressed okay. I wasn't, you know, acting suspiciously to my knowledge. This is after I was a police officer. And so I walked out of the store. I was so humiliated. I didn't tell anybody about that. It was embarrassing. That's the face of discrimination. That's what happens with discrimination. People don't report it. People have enough money to buy things. People have enough money to be socially upward mobility. If things like that happen to them, they don't necessarily report it. So we only know about things that are reported to us. And people say, well, how many cases of this do you get? Or how many instances of that has happened? We'll never know that because people don't report it. I didn't report it. And I was the one that was enforcing fair housing laws. I knew all about discrimination. So that was an instance where I could really connect with people and say, why don't you tell somebody about it? I didn't tell anybody about it. I was so embarrassed. And I'm thinking, I thought about it and I lost sleep about it. And it was like, that was really humiliating. Here's a, 20-year-old kid, I'm 30-some years old, and he dissed me. He just put this underneath, you're not gonna steal anything from my counter. And so I was put in a position of being a victim and a suspect at the same time. Very difficult to deal with. So that's something that I can tell you right up front as far as a personal experience that kind of helped me work better with individuals who I have to tell them to get the message out and say something when it happens, otherwise it's going to happen over and over and over again. So that was a one experience that I had that from a personal standpoint that I really brought it home as to how things happen and why things don't change and why things that don't change, that can change so slowly.
So speaking of the discrimination, did you find Milwaukee any different from any other places that you've been?
Milwaukee seemed, as I said, to be less. There seemed to be fewer individuals who had friends or at least socialized outwardly. Obviously there were, but I'm talking about as far as general numbers of individuals, fewer interracial relationships. It seemed that people segregated themselves and didn't necessarily connect. And they were fine, like in classroom settings, in social settings, didn't really see much of that. And those individuals that did have interracial relationship seemed to be individuals that were either very educated, very comfortable in other kinds of social settings. So I didn't really run into a lot in my initial experience in Milwaukee that led me to believe this was a very integrated community. There were different sections of town where you didn't see different races at that time, and that seemed very odd to me from just an outsider's point of view.
So you've asked us to talk about discrimination.
Mm-hmm.
What are some examples of discrimination that you could give us that are commonly not seen
Mm-hmm.
as wrong or discriminatory?
Since I work in housing, I can give you a lot of those. Are also obviously employment and education, those kinds of things. In housing, let me give you an example. We investigate discrimination complaints by a method called testing. And testing, not like academic testing. Testing basically means there are individuals, if for example, an African-American woman came and said that she thought she had been turned down for a rental unit that she had seen in the newspaper or seen on online, she would come to us and say, this is what happened to her. She called to make an appointment to see the place. She arrived at the appointment on time. When she got there, the person looked kind of stunned and said, well, you know, we don't have anything available. We don't have anything available still. And she said, well, I saw the ad in the newspaper. He said, well, you know, maybe my wife rented the place out before we took the ad out. He said, but we can put you on a waiting list. So the person puts their name down on a waiting list. They get all of the information. They take off. They leave. A day or two later, they check back. That ad's still running in the newspaper. So they may call us back. And at that point, we conduct an investigation. And I said we investigate through testing. And basically what we do with that, I'm going to tell you this very quickly, is that we take the complaint, we get all the information about that person, every piece of socioeconomic information that is pertinent. So we get where they work, if they work, what their family structure is, the number of debts they have, how long they've been on the job, all of those kinds of things. And then we match another individual through our volunteer tester pool. We have volunteers who we train, and they go out and help us with these investigations. So we would find, in the case of a 35-year-old African-American woman who works at one of the retail stores making $25,000 a year, we would match an individual, say to one of our testers, here are your characteristics for the day. So they're going to be a 25-year-old African-American, get an African-American woman, and here are their characteristics, their family size. They're looking for a 2-bedroom unit apartment at the same place for this same rent, and then we'd send them out there and see what happened. We'd also match that person to a white woman, same age, same type of job, same family structure, same debts, same everything, and then we'd send her out after the African-American woman went. So the African-American woman and the white tester don't know each other. They don't even know what they're testing for. They could be testing for a disability. They could be testing for family size. They could be testing for race, religion, whatever. All they know is that here's what I'm doing. Here are my characteristics. I'm going out to this unit, and I'm asking for a 2-bedroom apartment, and I want to occupy it immediately. And that person's partner does the same thing. So when they come back, the African-American woman's told, just like the complainant, the person who initially filed the complaint, gee, we don't have anything right now. We can put you on a waiting list. An hour later, the white tester comes, matched identically to those two people, except that person's white. So they've got all the same characteristics, and in some cases, they have less time on the job. They earn less money. They have more debts. So they're a better candidate for that job, for that apartment. So they go to the apartment, talk to the same apartment manager, and that apartment manager says, oh yeah, we got a couple of vacancies. Let me show you around. So within an hour, we have a totally different story from what the black woman told us initially, and the black tester experienced, and the white tester who went. So when they bring that information back to us, we compare what happened to the white tester, compare what happened to the African-American tester, and then we go back to the complaint and say, here are the differences in treatment that we see based on race. Every other characteristic has been eliminated. So the landlord can't come back and say, well, this person worked here longer and that's why I picked the white person, or they came first and that's why I picked the white person. So we cover all the variables, and that's how we conduct testing. That's what I mean about the subtleties of discrimination. That black person had no reason to believe that that apartment had not, in fact, been rented and was put on a waiting list, very common. So that person goes about their way. They look for another apartment, they get another apartment, but every time an African-American person comes to that apartment complex, if that person's discriminating based on race, they're going to be put on a waiting list. Every time a white person comes, they're going to be shown a unit. That's how discrimination has. That's what I mean by subtle. It's not that we don't want you here, they're being treated discourteously. Give them great information, shown around. In fact, I can give you an example of what happened to me on a test. When I worked at the Fair Housing Council, very early on, I wasn't CEO initially, and I took complaints, but one day we had to work on this complaint very quickly, so me and one of my partners, one of my co-workers, and I went out on a test for this person. So what we did is I went out in response to this complaint. I went to this apartment complex. We drove out in the same car, which testers don't do, because testers don't even know each other. We drove out in the same car. We went on the south side apartment, parked around the corner from the apartment. I went in first, walked up to the door. They had the little pennants out, open for inspection, manager's office. Knocked on the door. The guy comes to the door. I said, yes, I'm here to see the 2-bedroom unit you have advertised. 2-bedroom unit. I said, yes, advertised in the newspaper. I have the newspaper ad. So come on in, let me check that out. He said, I don't think we have any 2-bedrooms. He said, have a seat. So I had a seat in the living room, and I can see him in the kitchen, and he's going through these index cards and looking through index cards, and he looks on a clipboard. He comes back, he said, no, he said, my wife must have rented that, just like the story I told you before. He said, gee, I don't know why that ad's still running. And I said, well, listen, do you have a 1-bedroom? I said, the reason I wanted a 2-bedroom is because I've been going to school forever, which was true at that time. I was in school. And I could use a 1-bedroom. I wanted to use that second room as a den and put my books in it. And I can just stack my stuff up in a 1-bedroom until a 2-bedroom becomes available. And when it becomes available, I'll be first on the list. I said, can you check to see if you have a 1-bedroom? He said, oh, yeah. He said, I can check. And so he goes back in, and then he's making small talk, watching TV, asked me if I watch soap operas. I say, no, I work during the day. I don't see soap operas, just small talk. He goes back, he said, no, I'm really sorry. I don't have a 1-bedroom either. And I said, do you have something I can look at? I said, this is really close to where I'm going to be working. I said, the rent's great. I said, this is going to be perfect. He said, well, they basically look like my place. He said, I said, I don't have a model. He said, but you can look around my place. So he shows me around his place. Then he's feeling very comfortable with me, takes me down, shows me the basement, the storage area, asked me if I play golf. I said, yeah. He said, the golf course not far away, the green fees are great. I said, this is great. He said, this is where you can park. So he spends about 15 minutes with me. So then he comes back. He says, he said, I'm really sorry we don't have anything available. He says, you're the kind of person we'd like living here. And he said, he said, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I don't make the decisions here. He said, I'm going to give you this card. He said, this is my business card. He said, I'm going to write a number on the back. He said, as I was looking through the clipboard, he said, I saw a lease that'll be coming up in a couple of weeks. I'm going to check with that woman and see if she's going to renew her lease. He said, that might be the perfect unit for you. I said, oh, this is great. I said, that'll be great. So he gives me the business card. He said, don't call in the front. That's my number. He said, just give me back. He said, call this number. That's the downtown office. And he said, check to make sure that you're giving me a call back. And I said, great. I said, I'll check on Monday. He said, thanks. He said, take care. I walked back out to the car where Fred, my partner, is sitting. And I said, Fred, let's go. I said, there's no problem here. I said, this guy's wonderful. He wanted to adopt me. I said, he's wonderful. He said, he just treated me courteously, offered me coffee, showed me around the whole place. I said, it's really hot out here. I said, let's get going. I said, there's nothing here. Fred said, well, as long as we're here. He said, let me follow up. I said, are you kidding? I said, here I am sitting in a car by myself in a white neighborhood with people looking out of the window at me, a guy pretending to cut his grass, the lawnmower's not even started, just going back and forth so he can keep an eye on me. I said, he's really checking me out. I said, this is really uncomfortable. I said, you're going to get me arrested out here. He said, no. He said, I'll be back. I said, okay. So I'm sitting out in Fred's car waiting for him. Fred is gone for a half hour. I'm thinking, what in the heck? What are you doing? I said, just check it out and get back. Fred comes back and he says, so no units were available. I said, no. I said, same thing you found out. He said, I was shown 2 vacant 2-bedroom units by the same guy I had just talked to. That's what I mean by subtleties. So had I been really looking for this unit, I would have been that guy's best advertisement. I said, you know what you hear about these units on the south side where you can't get units because you're black? I said, you should go to this place. I would have told everybody about this unit, that this guy treated you wonderfully and he was going to have me check downtown, and he's going to look through things and follow up with me. I would have never reported him to the Fair Housing Council. I would have never reported him to HUD, which is the federal agency that deals with housing discrimination, or the state, Equal Rights Division, that deals with statewide violations. I would have reported. In fact, I would have been an ambassador for this guy had we not had that testing. And that's what the Fair Housing Council does. We do testing. So the subtleties of discrimination can be uncovered with this type of investigation. And in many instances, it's the only way to uncover it, because I personally, this old veteran police officer who is learned to read people, know what alleys to go down with whom and what cars to get into with whom or not, and now a person working in fair housing, all that was out the window. This guy had me totally fooled. And so I would not have reported, and this is happening every day. It's happening as we're sitting here today doing this discussion. And people don't report it because they don't know what happened. And so had we not done that test, the guy would still be doing it. And Fred, everybody doesn't take a partner along and say, check it out after I leave. We do that. So that's how we uncover discrimination. And we've had, thousands of cases over the years. Of the cases that actually go to court, we've had close to 800 cases go to federal or state court where people actually fight and say, no, I didn't do this, and we have our evidence with the testers coming saying this happened to me and this happened to me, and disputing that claim by the housing providers. And we've had about, as I said, close to 800 cases. We've only lost 8 cases over the years. Of the thousands of other cases that we have where complaints are brought, they settle. So we don't even have to go to court. But of those that go to court, we have a very good track record.
So you explained that situation. Was that earlier in your career? So
That was early in my career. That was probably a couple of years after I started when I actually did that. But we do this every day. That's what the Fair Housing Council does. So we are statewide at this point. We have 3 offices. One here in Milwaukee covering the 4-county metropolitan Milwaukee area, Milwaukee, Ozaukee, Washington, and Waukesha counties. We have an office in Appleton which covers Brown, Calumet, Winnebago, and Outagamie counties. And we have an office in Madison which covers Dane County. We also cover the city of Fond du Lac. So that's what we do. It still goes on. It's different depending on whether you're looking to rent a house, buy a house, get homeowner's insurance, or get a mortgage. So there's different ways you do testing based on the situation.
So early in your career, what time was that time period?
It was in the 70s. So I started in 1978 was when I started at the Fair Housing Council. And I was an intake person. So a couple of years into doing complaint intake, 1981, the person who actually started the Fair Housing Council moved to the Justice Department and started a testing program at the U.S. Department of Justice. And I was then moved into the CEO position. So I've been in the CEO position since 1981 and actually been with the organization since 1978.
So how did you get into fair housing? Did you come into it right out of college, or was it an internship in college? How did it happen?
Well, actually, when I was in college doing my graduate work, one of the courses I took had community leaders, community representatives come in and talk about what kinds of things those community organizations did, because my emphasis was on community organizations. How they operate, what they do, what their success, how they measure successes given that these problems are recurrent. So one of the courses I had actually had community people coming in, and I said, gee, that sounds like something I'd like to get into. I had no idea what I wanted to do as far as connecting these resources to the people who needed them. I didn't know if a job like that existed, so I was thinking maybe a government job. But these nonprofits that came in had very interesting ways that they seemed to connect resources to the individuals and the communities that needed them. So one of the people who came in, there was an organization back many years ago called ESHAC, E-S-H-A-C, Eastside Housing Action Coalition. And the director there came in and spoke, and I said, gee, that's the kind of thing I think I'd like to do. So I applied for all of these jobs. I applied for community organizer. Boy, I must have gone to maybe 8-10 places trying to get a job as a community organizer, but kept getting turned down because I didn't have any experience in community organizing. So that was very frustrating because I said, well, how do you get experience if you never get a job? So I kept going to these interviews. I kept going to second interviews. One of the people there who I did interview with at ESHAC told me, you know, you seem like a great candidate. We're going to go with the person who has the experience, but there's another group that's just getting started called the Fair Housing Council, and I think they have an opening, and this might be something you'd look into. So I'm kind of hesitant because I had such bad success with all these other places without the experience. So I went into do an interview at the Fair Housing Council. After Fred Freiberg, who was the person who was the first executive director of the Fair Housing Council, came to speak to our symposium. So we had a little class, about 10 of us at the professor's house, and speakers would come in and tell us all about it. So very intimate, very easy to talk with and get questions answered and kind of get a feel of what these folks really did. And so I had already met Fred through that, and then I went through an interview process and then was offered this position. So I've been there ever since.
Since you started, do you think the discrimination in Milwaukee is getting better or worse?
I don't think it's getting better. I think it's gone into different avenues. So people ask me that, do you think things have improved? There's a higher awareness of what discrimination is. There's very, very, very few instances where people can say, gee, I didn't know I couldn't do that because of a person's race, religion, color, sex, national origin, disability, marital status. With all the information that's out there, there are very few defensible arguments that you can say, gee, I didn't know I could turn that person down because they were black. I didn't know. I thought I could turn them down because it was my house. Well, there are instances in which you can do that under state law. Under federal law, there are no examples of where if you don't live in the unit, you can't also deny a person based on any of what we call protected classes. So, yes, I think I can say that there's a higher awareness of it. I can't definitively say it's gotten better or worse. I can say that the number of reports at one point were really at a high level. They tend to drop off after there are more instances where people have vacancies, for example, in housing, where we call the tenant of last resort, where they don't really want to rent to this Latino person or they want to rent to this single parent, but gee, they got to rent this unit out, so they take them. And so that person gets in the unit, but as soon as the market picks up, then they don't necessarily have to be that helpful anymore. So I've seen it rise and fall throughout the years, but generally I'd say it's become more sophisticated and it's more confusing for the home seeker. So we're just talking to you about rentals, but the sales market is very confusing to begin with. Mortgage lending is very confusing. Homeowners is very confusing. And people generally, not knowing the process, take the person who's giving them the information, they take it at their word. So if you say, well, your credit score isn't high enough to afford this loan or to make the payments, yeah, my credit doesn't look that good anyway, and I have missed a few payments and had this situation, so they go someplace else. If a white person comes, if it's race, that white person's told, your credit rating's not so good, but there's some classes you can take. There's some first-time home buyer courses that you can take that'll show you how to bring your credit rating up and how to put you get better organized with how you pay your bills. You should take a couple of those classes and then come back and see us. Don't necessarily tell the black or the African American or Latino person that, so the African American or Latino person doesn't have that same information. That's discrimination. It's information not being provided equally, and you're supposed to provide information equally. So those kinds of things are the things that we see now, which still are very pervasive, but individuals don't know it because it doesn't seem unreasonable. Sure, yeah, my credit's bad, so I'll go someplace else, or I wait until I can, have a bigger down payment. When that same information for being helpful isn't provided to another person of a different race or marital status or other types of social situations that are prohibited by law. And insurance, homeowners insurance is a mess. It's a prime example of being confusing, and there's also discrimination in those areas.
So do you think the issue? Well, let me restate this.
Mm-hmm.
We talked about Milwaukee being a segregated city, and Milwaukee is one of the most segregated cities. So do you think that the issue of discrimination is more prevalent in Milwaukee than in other cities or other bigger cities?
I don't think the issue of discrimination is necessarily more prevalent. I think segregation, the actual housing patterns are different. Where people live, that's segregation versus discrimination. Discrimination, you just get turned down or denied something. Segregation actually are the patterns, what your community physically looks like. Before I respond to that, I want to also clarify something that may not come up. People talk about diversity versus integration. two totally different different situations. So people say, oh, we have a very diverse community. That doesn't necessarily mean it's integrated. And so what the Fair Housing Council seeks and what social justice seeks is that individuals make choices based on the information they have and their desires. The choices aren't made for them. So you can have a diverse community and it's not necessarily integrated. So an example of that is, diverse community is that you have a block, you have a square area, census tract or a community. It's diverse because you have African Americans living over here, Latinos living over here, Asians living over here, and whites living everywhere else. That's diverse. That community as a whole is diverse. There are a lot of different kinds of people who live there. They're not integrated because the black people live over here, Latinos live over here, and the Asians live over here. That's not integration. That's diversity, but it's not integration. And so what we seek to do is to make sure if people want to, it's not that they have to, if people want to, they have those choices. And if you only have one choice, if you only have one option, you don't have a choice. And so we want to make sure that that's expanded upon. In Milwaukee, the patterns of segregation come along are historical. And they're different in many communities because actually the housing providers, what we call the gatekeepers, the people who make decisions about how housing is sold and purchased and where people live and how communities are designed, those people have the influence and information that they share with some and don't share with others. So that accounts for how segregation actually happens. Back in the 20s, even before the 20s, but I'm going to start you with the 20s, in 1924, the Board of Realtors in Milwaukee said that they needed to do something about making sure that African Americans stayed within a certain area and didn't spread out into other areas. So this is one of the reasons that Milwaukee looks different, is that it was by design that a professional organization who deals with how housing is sold, where it's sold, who gets to have access to that, they decided that we've got to do something about this problem. So they, in short terms, they set up a rule that you could not sell a home to an African American if an African American did not already live in that community, in that neighborhood. So basically that contained African Americans in certain areas where they already lived and allowed other people within that community to move fairly smoothly. They could move wherever. So if you didn't live in neighborhood X already and there weren't already blacks living in neighborhood X, you didn't if you had an African American customer, you didn't show them an home in community X. They got to see Y, Z, A, wherever other African Americans were. So that actually by design contained information, but also contained people's choices as to where they live. So that's discrimination. There's a practice, or was a practice, called block busting. Block busting meant that white individuals living in these communities that had African Americans living 5, 6, 7 blocks away, real estate agents would come in and tell those white homeowners, you know, there's some African Americans not too far from here. There's some blacks. They're moving closer into your neighborhood. Your property values are going to go down. You know, once they move in or get close to you, higher crime rates, the schools are going to be terrible. You should probably sell your home now while we still get a good price for it. I don't know what we are going to be able to get you for this house in 5 years. So people were panicked. That's called panic selling. People were told that if they didn't get out of their community now, with African Americans starting to move into or close to those neighborhoods, they're going to lose their property. They're going to lose their property values. So whites started moving out of those communities. African Americans were then sold those homes at lower prices, which actually made the property values go down. So then African Americans were basically guided as to where they could live and where they couldn't live by what was available and made available to them. And lending institutions did something similar by what we called redlining. Lending institutions would not allow people to get mortgages if they didn't already live in certain communities. So if you wanted to live in a suburban community as an African American living in the inner city, you couldn't get a mortgage out there. You can get a mortgage to live in here, but they wouldn't give you mortgages to live anyplace else. So that, by design, contains individuals and basically segregates, and this is in very simple terms, segregates individuals. But those are some of the ways that segregation in Milwaukee occurred. It was by design and was by the people who had the information and actually could provide access to people that wanted other housing opportunities. They actually prevented them from making those moves and having those choices.
So, since these patterns are so old, how do you think we can break through them and become more integrated instead of just diverse?
You know, the main problem with that, people always talk about having more laws, having better laws. The laws are there. We need to enforce the laws. And so laws work for everyone. They work for the people selling the homes, and they work for the people seeking to purchase those homes. So I think until there is a political will, there are individuals willing to make sure that the laws are enforced, and there are actual penalties for individuals who violate those laws. I think the major problem there is that it's not high on anyone's list as far as a major problem. People still think if you got enough money, you can live wherever. If you got a good education, you can live wherever. And there are also individuals who think that from a standpoint of social hierarchies, if I've done everything as a white person, and I'm just using race in this instance because there are other examples as well. If I've done everything as a white person and I've moved to this exclusive neighborhood and the housing's nice, one or two persons who are minorities, that doesn't do much for my neighborhood. It's not bad. That's okay. If there are more individuals who start moving in, then it starts looking like, I don't know, this is kind of looking like maybe my neighborhood doesn't have that status, and maybe my property values are going to go down, and maybe there are going to be some other issues, so I better start looking. There are two components to this. One is called white flight, where whites actually move out of areas. And the other is where actually individuals are judged based on who they are or what they look like as opposed to who they are. So it's called tipping. So there's been a lot of studies done where what whites will tolerate as to how many African Americans, how many people of other races move into their neighborhood before they start feeling uncomfortable. It's the tipping point. So with 100 houses, 2 or 3 African Americans, Latinos, not too bad. When we start getting up around 15, 16, starting to get a little uncomfortable. And when you get higher than that, that becomes the tipping point. So all neighborhoods within different areas have different tipping points. And so as the tipping points become to be realized, whites move out, what we call in urban studies, it's an upward or lateral housing filtration, which means basically whites move out of an area, African Americans fill that vacancy, and then you have this total circle coming in. So in the old days, for segregation, in the old days you had a situation where whites lived in the city, close to the jobs, close to the markets. African Americans lived around the city. African Americans then started moving into areas in the city because the housing then started to get depleted. A house that somebody bought new was now 50 years old. They moved out to another place. African Americans could now afford to move into an older home, so they started moving into those areas. That housing then becomes a core, what people now call the inner city. So the inner city then becomes African American. Whites start moving out into rings, which we now call suburbs. And if you move out further, it's called exurban areas. So then you start developing your pattern. So as whites move out of areas, other races move in, whites move further out. And then there's something called gentrification, where the whites now move back into the areas where the African Americans are, because now you've got the amenities for the theater, and we've got the shops and all of those kinds of things that attract people. They move back in, which displace African Americans moving there, and the African Americans have very little options of places to go. They still can't afford the suburban communities, so they end up in this ring outside of the inner city. So it's a very interesting concept, but that's how segregation is promoted. That's how segregation starts, and pretty soon you have people just hopscotching. People who make the money are the folks who are the housing providers, because they always have a market. So if you move here, I can sell it to you. If you move back, I can sell it to you. So it's beneficial to keep things rolling in that way. So that's one of the ways segregation occurs and has become institutionalized.
So very early in the interview, you mentioned that as a child you drove down to Alabama.
Mm-hmm.
So were you old enough to recognize any patterns or things that were different from Rockford or Milwaukee?
Absolutely. Absolutely. We, my sister and I, my younger sister and I, and my mom and dad drove. It was, gosh, I think it was like a 16-hour or 20-hour trip back in those days. But drove down, and as we got down to Alabama, Tennessee, there were certain places that you couldn't stop to go to the bathroom, which I thought was very odd. Jesus, is strange. So my dad would stop to get gas, and they would say, back then it was called colored. You were called colored as opposed to Negro or African American or black. So there are colored bathrooms and white bathrooms. So we drove to this gas station. My dad was going to get gas, and at that point nothing was self-service. Everything was full service. So the guy came out and asked how much gas he wanted. He said, could he use my dad asked if he used the bathroom. And the guy said, we want to have a colored bathroom. My dad said, well, is there a colored bathroom close? He said, no. So my dad said, well, I don't need the gas. So we had to drive around this little town until we found a gas station that had a colored bathroom. Let me tell you what the colored bathroom looked like. It looked like a pit. It was filthy, it was dirty, it was toilet paper all over, it hadn't been cleaned, and that's what black people had to use and could only use that. If you were found using a white bathroom, you could be arrested, which is totally crazy. I mean, when I was obviously growing up in Illinois, it was like, I never heard anything like this. This was insane. My dad stopped, I said, I was bothering me, I want a milkshake. Can we stop to get a milkshake? So we're driving down, we stop at this little place which would be equivalent of a Dairy Queen. It was not a Dairy Queen, I don't want to say that. Equivalent of a Dairy Queen. We stopped in there, and Dad was waiting in line, and the guy looks behind where my dad was standing behind him, looks behind, yeah, give me a black milkshake. In those days, black was akin to the N-word, because you called people Negroes or colored, you didn't call them black. So he said, give me a black milkshake, trying to agitate my dad. And my dad went up and went ahead with the transaction. I was just wondering, why is this guy so mean? Why is this guy doing this? I had never experienced anything. We're just getting, ice cream. After we got to where we were going, Athens, Alabama, where my other relatives live, they have a small farm there, we went in with my cousins to the movie theater. Oh, we go into the movie theater. I'm standing up to get my tickets. You have to go around to the side. I said, we have to go around to the side. Yeah, you have to go around the side. I said, so we go around to the side. The same woman taking the white tickets turns to the side and takes my ticket. I can't even stand in line to get a ticket at the movie theater. I got to go to the black, not even the black section. I got to go over here and get a ticket from the same woman, but I can't be in the same line as white people. Then we go into the movie theater, colored section upstairs. We have to go to the balcony, full of popcorn boxes, full of crap all over the floor, and watch the movie from the balcony, which was all rickety and nasty. White people could sit down on the main level. That's my personal experience. And then when we went to the park, there's a colored fountain, all crappy and rusty porcelain, and there's a white fountain. I was going over to get to the white fountain. My dad said, no, you can't drink over there. I said, what? Why not? That's the white people's fountain. Then I had to go around the corner, down to where pigeons are sitting on top of the thing, drinking out of the same thing, and drink out of the colored fountain. So that was quite a revelation to me, because I had never seen anything like that. In many instances, folks, after I moved here to Wisconsin, told me that they kind of liked the way it was in the South, African Americans, because they at least knew where they could go and where they couldn't. It was plain, don't go in here, don't go in here. And you guys have all heard about the sit-ins at the counter sit-ins and all of that. That stuff was happening when I was growing up. So that's the kind of experience. You couldn't go into restaurants, You couldn't go into movie theaters. You had certain places you couldn't go to the bathroom. It's like, wow, and then you hear the Pledge of Allegiance, liberty and justice for all, and it's like, really? For all, but how? And that gets into another area, which I'll talk to you about later, which is called separate but equal, which are the difference between de jure segregation and de facto segregation. All those kinds of things play into how our community and how our area, why it looks the way it does.
So it's been about an hour. We'd like to take a break.
Absolutely.
So before the break, you were talking about, you were just about to talk about de facto racism or segregation and de jure segregation. Could you explain what those are and
yes.
their relation to Milwaukee?
So de jure means by law. So de jure segregation is segregation by law. There are legal ordinances, lawful ordinances, statutes. In the old days, they were called Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws basically are de jure, cause de jure segregation, de jure discrimination. That's basically by law. So there are things that tell you where you can. I was mentioning to you earlier about the colored fountain and the white fountain. That was law. That was law. So if you didn't drink it there, or you didn't go to the bathroom where you were supposed to, you get arrested. If you didn't eat where you're supposed to, you didn't take the seat in the back of the bus where you're supposed to, that's de jure. And so those patterns followed not only with employment, public accommodations, which are hotels, restaurants, movie theaters, those kinds of things. Those things were actually in practice violations of the law. So that's de jure segregation. That's how, by law, communities were structured. You couldn't move here. There's something in Wauwatosa had a sunset. Was involved in what was called sunset laws, and these were all over the country. But sunset laws were if an African American was found in a neighborhood or area after sundown, they were physically, could be arrested, but they were physically taken by the police out of that neighborhood back to where their neighborhood was. So if it's sunset law and it's 8 o'clock in the evening and you're walking around North Avenue, you could be accosted, taken back to 12th and Center, for example. De facto is by practice. That's what that basically means. So that's where individuals who felt the pressure not to, walk around in certain communities at night or walk through neighborhoods at night, they started moving to areas where they were more comfortable, where people who looked like them were. So de facto segregation occurs as a result of people making choices to live in communities that they feel are more welcoming, are more comforting, things of that nature. So those are, in brief, that's the difference between de facto and de jure segregation. One's by law and one's by practice. So that makes a difference in how people perceive themselves and how others perceive them.
So I'd like to ask where you have lived in Milwaukee, and where you've lived in general, and do any of these places fit any of the patterns like de facto or de jure segregation that you've explained earlier?
When I first moved to Milwaukee, the first place I lived was 92nd and Congress. So it's right across from the Greek Orthodox Church, way over there on the west side. I had not a clue, coming from outside, what kind of neighborhood that was, who lived there, who didn't. But I think I was the only African American in my unit. So I hadn't looked for many other units, and as I can recall, those units that I did look at, I was told, they were rented or something. Now, that could have been discrimination, or maybe not. So, I didn't learn that until after I got into the business of fair housing, because that wasn't on my radar. So I actually lived there first, and I lived there for a couple of years. Then I moved to Sherman Park, lived on Sherman Boulevard, Sherman and Congress, or Townsend, Sherman and Townsend. So I lived in a duplex there. And let's see, from there, where did I move? From there, I moved to the east side, which, you know, the east side is very cool, still is. So I moved to the east side, so I moved over on Astor. And then I lived on Prospect, no, not Prospect. Yes, I lived on Prospect. And then I moved to Juneau Village. So I had a really cool apartment that faced the lake. That was wonderful. Then I moved, after being there for a while, I moved back to the west side, and I moved to Fond du Lac and Roosevelt. So we're talking about patterns. And then I lived at Fond du Lac and Roosevelt for 12 years, I think. And now I live in Indris Park, which is 68th Street area, Center, Locust, around in there. So Indris Park is a very, very integrated community. Sherman Park is an integrated community, going backwards. And the other communities, at the time I lived there, were integrated. Obviously, Juneau Village was integrated. Before that, living on the west side, that wasn't so integrated. So that was mostly white at the time I moved in there. So those are, as far as matching the racial patterns, initially I was the racial minority in my neighborhood. Then I moved to an area that was more racially integrated, Sherman Park. Then I moved east side, which is integrated, and downtown, not so much at that time. As far as people living downtown, there weren't that many large apartment units, complexes. And then, I also lived on Prospect. Yeah, I lived on Prospect, that was integrated as well. So fitting the patterns, I guess I've always lived in areas either where I was a racial minority, as opposed to living with other groups of minorities, or I lived in racially integrated neighborhoods. So I've always sought to move into neighborhoods that had a mix of socioeconomics, had a mix of racial composition, and different religions.
So, about religions, what religion are you? What faith are you? And what church do you go to, if any?
I am a Baptist. I was raised a Baptist, and I don't have a church here. I'm also a member of Congregation Shalom. My wife is Jewish, so I attend services with her there, although I haven't converted to Judaism. So we have an integrated religious family, but I still practice Christianity, and am very close to my wife's religion, Judaism. And there are a lot of differences, but there are also a lot of similarities. And so I've been attending the synagogue there for a number of years now with my wife.
So you talked about restrictive covenants.
Yes.
Over the break. What are those, and what are their relation to Milwaukee and its growing up in the housing market?
Well, its relationship to Milwaukee is that it's a prime example of how individuals' choices are limited. Restrictive covenants are basically provisions that are attached onto mortgage documents. They're filed at the clerk's office, and basically a group of individuals living in a specific geographic community decided that they are going to make the decision who lives in their neighborhood and who doesn't. So it's called a restrictive covenant because it's basically a plan, basically by design. No one who doesn't look like us or act like us can live in this neighborhood. The Washington Highlands is an example of a restrictive covenant in the Milwaukee area. So basically they had a rule, but for people who were servants, no one who was not white could live or purchase property in that neighborhood, in that area. It's a subdivision. And basically those were in place all over the United States. But it has particular interest here in Milwaukee because that was now another whole segment of an area where African Americans were told that by design the property owners there had made basically a pact that they would not sell property to anyone who wasn't white. So all of those homes in all that area were off limits. And they were deemed unenforceable many years ago, but it's still on the records. It's still on the property records still show restrictive covenants. So it has an effect, what we call a chilling effect, because if individuals who wanted to purchase there who weren't white saw that on the mortgage documents that this was a restrictive covenant, how am I going to be treated when I move in there? What's the reception going to be like? What's the interaction going to be like? So they don't look in those areas. And although they're unenforceable on the books, they still have this kind of gloomy cloud over individuals who might seek to move there. God, what does that say about me if I can't move into that neighborhood and I can afford to live there? So restrictive covenants have had a very, I think, interesting and impactful effect on where individuals live.
So, you're the CEO of the Milwaukee Metropolitan Fair Housing Council.
Metropolitan Milwaukee Fair Housing Council.
Milwaukee Fair Housing
Yes.
Council. So what do you do? What's your job, and how did you come upon becoming the CEO? Could you tell us of your ventures in the fair housing market?
Yes. So I became CEO. I initially started, as I had mentioned, as the housing counselor, which basically I did intake of complaints. People called with issues. They were basically concerned something happened to them, and they were wondering, gee, is this discrimination? So I would try to determine, based on their information they provided to me, whether or not what happened to them actually was a violation of federal, state, or local law. I also, as part of that job, provided counseling to home seekers, giving them information on what their rights were and responsibilities were as home seekers. And I also did presentations, fair housing presentations, not dissimilar to what I'm doing here, providing information on what the laws are and what housing discrimination looks like, and what types of remedies there are to provide assistance to those who may have been victims of housing discrimination. So after I did that for a while, I had also had experience in background in management and administration. I was interested in that. And when the person who preceded me moved on, I was promoted to CEO. As CEO, I'm responsible for the entire operation of the organization, from a personnel standpoint, from programmatic standpoint, financial, all of the things that make that organization run, I'm responsible for making sure happens, and happens in an effective and efficient manner. So one of the most important things is making sure you have funding, which is critical to any organization. Funding for this type of organization is very difficult because people think that there are already people taking care of these things. The federal government has HUD. The state government has the Equal Rights Division. The local government may have a fair housing ordinance that is enforced by the city attorney. The county may have the corporate council taking care of those kinds of matters. So we said, well, we went through this in the 60s. There was a law passed in 68. Gee, what's the problem? Why are you guys still, what do you need this for? And we do, as I mentioned to you earlier, very different things than the federal, state, or local governments do, because we have our testing component. With the other types of investigations that are conducted at the federal, state, and local levels, basically what they do is they've got one person complaining, another person as the defendant, saying the housing provider, and basically they go in and try to get a story from the complainant, and then they get a story from the housing provider. Well, the housing provider, if he or she is discriminating, say, it never happened. I never even saw this person. We don't do that. We got blacks living here. We got Latinos living in our buildings. What do they mean they were discriminated against? When you do the testing, which they don't do, then you get that extra story. Sometimes it corroborates what the landlord is saying, and sometimes it helps the victim tell his or her story. So that's the differences. So as the CEO, it's my job to make sure that that functions effectively and efficiently. And we have volunteers. In fact, we are the only fair housing organization in the country. I think there are about 120 organizations like ours around the country, private fair housing groups. We're not affiliated in any way, although there is a National Fair Housing Alliance that helps keep us all connected from a communication and legislative activities standpoint. But my job basically is to make sure that that information is gotten out to the public. We have to have a way of telling that there is a problem. We need funding to do it because we do things in cooperation with these other groups, not instead of, and not in a method of working with them and not against them. We're actually helping them develop information. My job also is to make sure we have a staff that is competent and capable of carrying out the activities that we've designed for programs. We have an enforcement program which does that investigation aspect of it. We have an outreach program which basically gets the message out. People go out into the community and talk like I'm talking to you now about the nature of the problem and that it still exists. And also help recruit volunteers who help us with our testing program. We have Inclusive Communities program. Inclusive Communities basically provides options for individuals who seek to identify housing throughout our metropolitan areas, housing mobility, making sure that people who want to rent can rent wherever they want to, and that there's affordable housing opportunities throughout the community. If you want to move out of an area and you only got this so much money, all communities have to do is price you out of the market. So if you want to live in XYZ county or XYZ community and there's no housing that fits your budget, you stay where you are, and that increases the concentration of poverty and segregation. So what we do with that program is try to identify ways to expand affordable housing opportunities. So there's affordable housing in every community. If you want to stay in the city, wonderful. If you want to move out, there are those opportunities that are available, that housing that you can afford can be made available in other communities. So that's what that program seeks. And we also have a fair lending program which helps people with mortgages, and we also work with banks to make sure that their policies and practices and products and services get out to everybody. Also keeps an eye on those banks. There's another provision of the law that makes sure that if people putting money into those banks can get money out within that neighborhood. Community reinvestment, it's called. And basically that ensures that the depositors, people putting money into those banks, can also receive that money within their neighborhoods, and that money doesn't go to some other neighborhood to help people with housing and small business and things of that nature. So we keep an eye on those kinds of things. So my job as CEO is to make sure all of those programs operate effectively, our staff operates effectively, we have communication with the general public, we have communication with government, we have communication with other law enforcement, and that everything works as seamlessly as possible. So that's what I've been doing since 1981.
Well, doing it for a while.
Yes.
But before you got a job as the housing counselor, you said you were denied jobs in other fields, in nonprofit organizations. Do you think that you were discriminated against, or do you truly believe that you were actually the second person there and weren't?
I think I was actually, most of those were community organizations because I was trying to get out of the kind of regular kinds of retail jobs and things of that nature, trying to get out of that field because my real interest was to get into community organizing community organizations. So I think all of the community organizations I went to, I think I really was at that time a victim of not having any experience, because I think they were really looking for somebody who could hit the ground running and get in and talk to these folks and organize the communities and make sure things happen. The problem with that was, one of the problems I think was the fact that I was a police officer, one of my previous jobs. And the kind of climate between the police community and the community organizations at that time was very tense, because community organizations, the chief of police at that time was very, putting it lightly, very hard on community organizations and community advocates and civil rights kinds of activities, which created this very deep schism between that part of the community and law enforcement. So me as a police officer, there were police officers that actually infiltrated community organizations back then. There were situations where you were put on a list or photographed if you were in civil rights marches or spoke out in the newspaper or had those kinds of experiences that were documented publicly. The police actually kept records of those. So police were looked on very suspiciously by people in the advocacy communities during that time. So I think that also may have played a role, particularly in some of the community organizations that had had difficulty with the police department. So here's a police officer applying for a job. What is this about? How is he going to be? Is this something that's he's really seriously doing, or is this some kind of other game that's being played? So I think that may have affected my employability.
Okay, so what do you think about, so earlier you stated that some people believe that fair housing is fair, but what do you think about those people and their opinions?
That they think everything's fine already?
Yes.
I think they're misinformed, and sometimes it's self-inflicted. Fair housing doesn't mean that you have to identify a place and move people into an area. Fair housing means that there's choice. And so I think those people that think that things are fine here, you can move wherever you can afford to, aren't really in touch with the types of experiences that individuals who are on either limited or fixed incomes, individuals who have disabilities, individuals who are attempting in every way to be part of a community, but for how they look or what perceptions people have of them, decisions are being made about them. So I think those folks that have that kind of response to everything's fine now, housing's already fair, I think are misinformed.
So in Rockford, did you grow up in an integrated community, or was it just, was it segregated?
Yes, in Rockford, I grew up in a community that was basically Italian, African American, and Latino. So yes, and my school looked that way, and as I progressed through my grades, it became more and more African American, fewer whites. There were also whites in that community, but the neighborhood specifically I grew up in, probably 80% African American, 10%. Maybe 5% Latino, and a very small segment of that white Italian ethnic.
So how do you think growing up in this integrated community benefited you in your studies today?
Well, I think that was something that I carried throughout. That was normal for me. So anything that doesn't look like that to me is weird. So it was normal to have friends of different races, Catholics, Baptists, Jewish people. All of us lived, worked together, played together, grew up together, went to school together. And then when I see that differently, it's like, this seems a little unnatural, because I know from personal experience that it works, and that's what you want. You want people with a diversity of experience, of diversities of cultures. That's how we learn. And it's not bad to be different. And I think, what we see now many times is that different is problematic. If you're different, there's a problem. And not that didn't happen back then. But it was, in my experience, it was not part of how I grew up and the people I had to interact with. So it's totally foreign to me to have people make assumptions about individuals. I had assumptions made about me. My dad and my mom always told me, when you're going out, dress like you're going out. So if I had a hole in my blue jeans, I couldn't go to the movie theater, because their concern was that was expected of a black person to have holes in their blue jeans. And that said something to the people who saw me about who I was. So it was weird for me to see white kids with holes in their blue jeans, and nobody cared, that didn't make a difference, but I had to really be dressed a different way. So my whole life was, I had to be a little bit better, and I had to be a little bit more thoughtful about how I acted in public and what I looked like in public and how I presented myself, because how I grew up, how my parents grew up in the segregation they were experiencing. My dad had a 6th grade education, my mom had a 9th grade education. They both had to drop out of school to take care of, the family, working for their families. It was a whole different, they wanted a whole different thing for me. So they didn't want me to be going down the street in, clothes that were dirty or clothes that were torn, because that would say something about the Tisdales. So when I went to school, my sisters who preceded me had a reputation of, being these good students and good musicians, and you're the Tisdale. You're gonna be first chair someday. So I had to be first chair. I've had to do well in school. It was expected, and we had individuals from our church and from our neighborhood who had. There's a saying that you folks as young as you are probably haven't heard about, but it takes a village. But all of us were always on guard. If you messed up someplace and the neighbor lady saw you messing up, she'd tell your mother. And it wasn't that you go back and sass her and say, yeah, I can do whatever I want. She would tell your mom, and in fact, in some cases, call your mom on the spot. So you knew everything you did, wherever you went, the neighbors were taking care of you and going to be watched. So you grew up in a certain way. So that was my experience growing up, and I think that carried through my life. So experiencing that integration, experiencing that diversity. I had sleepovers at my white friends' houses. They had sleepovers at mine. Then you get out into this other world, and it's like, oh, you can't be friends with this person, or this person only sees you when you're doing something socially. They don't live next door to you, because that says something about you and them. So it's a whole different, banging in your head once you get out there and say, well, this is very strange. And I still think it's very strange.
So you talked about your father having a 6th grade education and your mom having a 9th grade education. Mm-hmm. How did your parents meet?
My parents met. My dad was in Rockford working at a factory, and my mom came up to visit her relatives who were already here. And somehow their families knew each other. They were going to introduce my mom to my dad, and he actually met her as she got off the train from Chicago to Rockford, coming up from down south. And that's how they met, and they started dating. So she was coming up to, I think her sisters already lived here. My dad and his brothers lived in Rockford and Chicago and Cleveland. So they were, this industry at that time was booming back at post-World War II, I should say, which war? Post-World War II was booming. And there were many jobs. I think in Rockford there were 600 factories in Rockford. So work was plentiful. People came there to work, and then my mom moved up, moving from the south so that she could find some work and make her life better, and so that's how they met.
Well, speaking about meeting, how did you meet your wife?
I met my wife at work. My wife, Carla, is also employed at the Fair Housing Council, and so I started a week ahead of her. I started June 19th, 1978. She started June 23rd, 1978. She was a VISTA volunteer at the Fair Housing Council. So I started on Monday. She started on a Friday. We had a little staff lunch. There were only 5 people on staff at that time. And we had a $62,000 budget. So I had really made some financial changes in my life, from being a cop, making quite a bit more than that, 3 times more than that, to taking a $12,000 a year job. So that was an adjustment. But she was making less than I was, because she had a $125 a month stipend that she got from VISTA, which is Volunteers in Service to America, VISTA. And she was a VISTA volunteer assigned to the Fair Housing Council, or got a job at the Fair Housing Council, and she actually structured and ran our testing program, our enforcement program, and she's now seen as a preeminent expert in testing. She's been an expert witness in federal cases around the country, and that's how we met. So we met at work. So I always tell everyone I had seniority because I got 4 days on her. So that's how it happened. So we met at work, and then I think we knew each other like 15 years before we got married. Yeah.
So you mentioned you've had a couple different titles as you've gone up through the Fair Housing Council. What were her titles? How did they affect your job?
Not my job so much as that she was a key part of the organization. My title, I was just a housing counselor, and I moved to executive director. And then as the organization expanded and I had more job duties that required more policy decisions, I moved into president and CEO, which is actually part of the board, our board of directors. Her job titles, she was the test coordinator, investigator, investigative coordinator, and then she was a deputy director, and now she's executive vice president. So we both have 39 and a half years of experience in our jobs. So we've been there a while. And we do trainings all over the United States with other fair housing groups, with government organizations, HUD. We do consulting work all over the country now.
So before you talked about misinformation of people.
Mm-hmm.
So do you think the misinformation of them in regards to segregation affects the progress to desegregate the communities that we live in?
Yeah, I do. I think that it makes a difference, because if people think that everyone has the same choices and we have what's called a level playing field, they're not so much inclined to provide any type of assistance or to monitor how things go. So if you think everything's all right, you're not going to pay much attention to how you can do, what you can do, or what needs to be done to make change. So I think that impacts it. And people have a lot of feelings, I'm saying this generally, people have a lot of feelings about, I got mine and I worked hard for my stuff, why am I helping somebody who's not working as hard, whether or not they know what that person's doing. So I think perceptions play a large role in misinformation and lack of progress.
Okay, so how can we inform these people in Milwaukee? Do we teach them classes, or what do we do?
What you're doing now is very good, getting the word out, getting a variety of people talking about their stories, getting a variety of people talking about their experiences in a variety of fields. This is something that is not only nurturing, but it's important for individuals to learn about, to hear about. And until people start living together, I don't think that things are going to change much. Knowing someone or living next door to someone is there's a whole different concept that takes on. You're actually interacting with people as neighbors, interacting with people as friends, and you can't read about something and really get the true benefits of it. You can't read about, gee, this was a problem, and know what it's like. To actually hear those people's stories that I've told you today, these are things that happened to me. And I've always strived to, present myself in a professional manner, in a manner where I was polite. I still get treated badly. And why does that happen? And some people get discouraged when that happens. It's like I've done everything possible. I've got an education, I've got the right job, I've done all of this, and I still get denied housing, jobs, all of that. What's the use? And so in order to continue to make sure that there is a use, there is a connection between these, people have to tell their stories of successes, of difficulties, and make sure that individuals understand that there are things that they can do and are things that need to be done to help move us forward. And until people start taking a personal interest in things, nothing's going to change, because it's always somebody else's problems. And problems are all of our problems, because what impacts me impacts everyone. That works whether the top or the bottom, it helps. So those are the kinds of things that we try to get the message out. And until people are listening to that message, they're not doing anything about it. And it takes a community. It takes all of us. We have volunteers. We need volunteers. But it takes all of these folks working together. I can't, with a small staff, change the housing patterns in Milwaukee and Wisconsin. They've developed, as I've indicated, institutionally over the years. There's no way I'm going to undo that. It's going to take all of us working together to make change. And until all of us participate, all of us are going to suffer.
So you mentioned that the Fair Housing Council is a nonprofit organization. Where are the biggest donators that you see?
Our biggest contributors, our biggest contracts, we actually are contracted. Our largest contractors are through the federal government. We receive federal contracts, grants. We receive contracts from the state. We receive contracts from local communities. Local communities receive money from the federal government, and they can decide how that money is used. So many local communities within our service areas that I mentioned in Madison, Milwaukee, and in Appleton, many of those provide contracts for us to work on fair housing activities and diminish the kinds of experiences people may have with housing discrimination. And we also have foundations that provide funding, and we also are membership-based, so we also have people who provide membership funds for us and donations and contributions, but the largest money comes from the federal, our largest resources from the federal government.
So do you have any other stories about discrimination or segregation in fair housing that you haven't told us that you'd like to tell us?
Hundreds. Yes, you know, discrimination occurs. I don't have anything more in particular. I think what I provided as far as how it occurs kind of gives you a sense, but it occurs in so many different ways and for so many different reasons. Persons with disabilities often have a very difficult time because people have a perception of what people with disabilities can and cannot do. And in many instances, they're wrong. They need different accommodations and different modifications, but they live very full lives. But people hear, oh, a person with a disability wants to live, or a person who has a sight impairment, that's going to be a problem. And dismiss those people outright. So many of those instances occur. Or what a single woman with children, oh, she's not going to be able to do this or that. Gosh, people have been turned down with degrees in civil engineering or degrees in engineering because they're a woman and they don't think that they can fix the furnace. They may have designed furnaces. People have perceptions that carry over, and what fair housing attempts to do is that everyone is treated on an equal basis, and I don't think that's happened. So I can give you lots of different stories, but they'll all have a similar theme. They'll all be that people have decided on the basis of how someone looks or what their perception is of someone, instead of that individual. And all individuals are individual. They're all different. And you have to take people on a case-by-case basis and not make general assumptions. So we have stories about people who have said they'll never rent to another black person. And then we hear, well, why not? Well, I had a black family in here, and they tore the heck out of my place. They burnt the rug, they tore the door off, they marked up on the walls. They were just awful. I'll never rent to another black person. And so, well, over the years that you've been in housing, have you ever had that happen with a white person? Oh, yeah. Yeah, we had terrible kids tearing screen doors off and, spilling stuff on the carpet. So how is that different? So now you've decided, based on a couple of instances that happened with African Americans, that the whole race now is you've written out the whole race. You've had similar instances with white individuals. That's just the way things run. So how is that equal? And so our message is, if you got a policy or a rule, treat it and apply it universally, and treat it and apply it fairly. So those are the kinds of stories that I have. But almost in every instance of the thousands of cases that we've had, it's something that fits that same theme, that there's, the guy deciding on tenants, he's going to pick numbers out of a hat. All the numbers that come out of the hat of the people who apply are always white. How's it happen? Or we don't have an application process. We just kind of have a gut reaction. Where your gut reaction is always negative toward people with disabilities or women. So those are the kinds of things that we try to get people to see aren't fair, and in order to treat people fairly, you're going to need to have some kind of uniform standard of deciding who moves into your places, who gets your mortgages, who gets your homeowner's insurance, who buys your house. Those are the kinds of things that we look at with fair housing. It's equal.
So earlier you talked about equal but separate.
Separate but equal?
Yeah, separate but equal.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that many still cherish that idea today in
certain
aspects?
I think that certain aspects of that still exist. It generally was applied to transportation back in the old days with trains and buses, and then moved down into housing and employment. But I think many times those kinds of attitudes and perceptions and practices still occur. If you got something, everybody's got the same book, but you don't have the same teachers. Everybody's got the same information, but it's not applied or provided on the same basis. So separate but equal never works, because separate is always unequal. There are always differences. If you're all doing the same thing at the same time with the same information, that's equal. If you're separating it, there's always going to be differences. You can't, there are never two things. You pour half a glass of water, one part, you've got a full bottle of water, you pour half in one glass and half in the other. There's always a little more in the other glass. So if you want a whole glass of water, keep it in the same glass. And that's the concept that we have of separate but equal. That doesn't work. Equal is uniform, equal is the same.
So we're wrapping up now. Do you have any questions that you think we should still ask?
No, I think you covered very comprehensively, given the time that we've had, very comprehensively the topics and why I am who I am and my experiences in Milwaukee and my experiences, what led to my experiences, but I think you did an excellent job on doing that. No, I think that the message that you were trying to convey and have out in the community, I think you've done a good job, very good job of getting that message out based on the time that we had today. I appreciate it.
Thank you.